When you hear the name Hercules, your mind instantly creates an image of a perfect hero, a man blessed by the gods, admired by the world, and remembered as the strongest figure to ever walk the earth. That image feels ancient, familiar, and safe, as if it has always been true and never needed to be questioned. But myths are rarely designed to tell the truth. They are designed to make power look beautiful. Because this story was never really about strength, courage, or heroism, it was always about control. Hercules wasn't chosen because he was worthy. He was used because he was useful. And usefulness has always mattered more than freedom. Once you begin to see his story this way, the myth stops feeling distant and symbolic and starts feeling uncomfortably familiar. This is not the story of a man who rose above the gods, but of a man who survived beneath them, carrying expectations he never agreed to. And the reason this story still lingers after thousands of years is simple, because power has not changed, only the way it hides. Hercules was strong from the moment he was born, not because he trained for it or earned it, but because power was placed inside him before he ever understood what strength meant or what it would cost him. While other children learned limits, patience, and restraint, Hercules learned excess, force without guidance, and power without instruction, and power like that is never left alone for long. From the very beginning, his strength separated him from the world around him because people admire power loudly but fear standing too close to it. No one teaches a powerful child how to be gentle, how to process pain, or how to slow down. They only teach him how to carry more, lift more, and remain useful even when it begins to damage him. Hercules was praised for what his body could destroy and endure, but never guided in understanding what his mind and heart were becoming under the weight of constant expectation. The gods watched him grow not as guardians shaping a man, but as distant observers measuring how much pressure he could survive before finally breaking. Strength created admiration, but it also created control, because when power exists without permission, authority begins to feel threatened. Hercules was never allowed to simply exist, never allowed to be ordinary, because his value was always tied to what he could lift, fight, or overcome. Long before his punishment began, Hercules was already trapped by expectations that were never his to choose. When madness finally took control of Hercules and his strength turned inward, the tragedy was not just what he destroyed, but how quickly the world decided what that destruction meant. The gods did not ask what kind of pressure creates a man who breaks like this. They did not ask who failed him, or why such power was left without guidance. They looked at the aftermath and saw something far more valuable than justice. They saw leverage. Guilt is the most effective chain ever created, because a guilty man will punish himself long before anyone else needs to. Hercules did not need to be imprisoned, threatened, or silenced, because shame had already done that work for them. His grief made him obedient, his regret made him predictable, and his need for redemption made him controllable. The gods understood that a man desperate to atone will accept any burden, no matter how impossible or cruel. So instead of offering healing or understanding, they offered him a path that looked like forgiveness, but functioned like control. Madness was not the end of Hercules' story, it was the beginning of his usefulness. What makes this story truly unsettling is not what happened to Hercules, but what the gods chose not to ask when everything fell apart. They never asked why a man raised around endless expectations was given no guidance, no limits, and no understanding of the power placed inside him. They never asked how isolation, pressure, and constant use could distort even the strongest mind. Asking why would have meant accepting responsibility, and power rarely questions itself. To the gods, explanations were unnecessary, because explanations lead to accountability, and accountability weakens authority. It was easier to declare the tragedy a personal failure than to admit it was the result of neglect. By refusing to ask why, the gods preserved the illusion that this system was perfect, and that only Hercules was flawed. This allowed them to shift blame without changing anything, keeping their power intact while placing the entire weight of guilt on one man. Silence became a decision, and that decision ensured the system could continue exactly as it was. The 12 labors are often remembered as heroic challenges, but in reality they were something far more calculated, than a test of courage or strength. Hercules did not choose these labors, did not negotiate their terms, and did not have the power to refuse even a single one. Each task was designed not to free him, but to occupy him, because a man who is constantly exhausted never has time to question the system controlling him. The labors created a routine of obedience, where suffering became normal and resistance slowly disappeared. Kill this monster, clean this corruption, carry this impossible weight, and move on to the next command without asking why. By keeping Hercules in constant motion, the gods ensured that his strength never turned inward toward reflection or outward toward rebellion. Redemption was the story told to the world, but discipline was the reality enforced upon Hercules. The labors transformed punishment into productivity, making suffering appear meaningful while ensuring complete control. Over time, obedience stopped feeling like coercion and began to feel like purpose. The cruelest irony of Hercules' life is that the very thing people admired most about him was the same thing that made escape impossible. A weak man can disappear, a powerless man can be ignored, but Hercules could never vanish because his strength made him too valuable to be left alone. Every time the gods needed something done, something lifted, something destroyed, Hercules was summoned, and saying no was never part of the equation. His strength kept him visible, predictable, and permanently within reach of power. Success did not bring freedom. It brought more responsibility, more expectation, and more demands that he could never escape. Each victory tightened the invisible cage around him, because proving his usefulness only confirmed that he belonged to the system. Strength did not protect Hercules from suffering. It guaranteed that suffering would never end. And the world applauded, because people love powerful figures as long as those figures continue to serve without resisting. In the end, Hercules was not trapped by chains or walls, but by the knowledge that his strength made him impossible to replace. What makes Hercules' suffering even more devastating is that he was never allowed to rest, because rest would have meant reflection, and reflection could have led to resistance. The gods never gave him time to grieve, to heal, or to understand what had been taken from him, because a man who pauses long enough might begin to question why he keeps obeying. Instead of silence, Hercules was given noise. Instead of stillness, he was given motion. And instead of recovery, he was given another task waiting just beyond the last. Exhaustion became a strategy, because a tired man does not rebel, he survives. Each labor bled into the next, creating a life where effort never ended and completion never meant relief. There was always another monster, another burden, another command disguised as purpose. Hercules was praised for his endurance, but endurance is not healing. It is simply the ability to suffer longer without collapsing. By denying him rest, the gods ensured that Hercules never had the clarity to imagine a life beyond obedience. And so his exhaustion was not a flaw. It was a feature of the system designed to keep him moving forward without ever looking back. What makes Hercules' story even darker is that his suffering was never hidden. It was displayed, celebrated, and turned into a spectacle for the world to admire. People did not ask whether the labors were cruel. They asked how impressive they were. Each victory was praised as heroism, even though every victory cost Hercules another piece of himself. The world learned to love Hercules not as a man but as a performance, because strength is easier to admire when it is distant and silent. Suffering becomes acceptable when it is useful, and noble when it entertains. The more Hercules endured, the more the world applauded, mistaking endurance for greatness and silence for consent. No one asked if he wanted this life, because asking would have disrupted the story that made everyone feel comfortable. Heroism became a mask that hid exploitation, and applause became a way of avoiding responsibility. By celebrating his suffering, the world helped the gods maintain control without ever lifting a hand. By the end of Hercules' story, it becomes clear that the greatest lie ever told about power is that it automatically brings freedom. Hercules had more strength than any man before or after him, yet he had less choice than almost anyone. Power did not give him control over his life. It stripped that control away by turning his existence into a constant obligation. Every expectation placed on him removed another possibility. until his strength defined him more completely than his own will ever could. Choice is what creates freedom, not power. And Hercules was powerful precisely because he was never allowed to choose. The gods did not fear Hercules' strength. They feared what might happen if that strength ever belonged to him. So they ensured that his power remained tied to guilt, obedience, and endless demand. In doing so, they created the perfect servant, a man strong enough to carry everything, and broken enough to never set it down. Hercules was not tragic because he was strong, but because strength was the only language power ever spoke to him in. Once you see his story this way, the myth stops feeling ancient and symbolic and starts to feel uncomfortably modern, because power still rewards obedience, still disguises control as honor, and still turns suffering into something to be admired. And that is why Hercules was never truly free. His story does not haunt us because it is old, but because it is still being repeated.